The blizzard hit the Arizona high country without warning, turning the December afternoon into a white hellscape that swallowed everything in its path. And somewhere in that frozen chaos, a woman was dying. Eleanor Bradford urged her mare forward through the snow that was already knee-deep on the horse, her fingers numb inside her leather gloves, her face stinging from the ice crystals that pelted her skin like tiny daggers. She had left Fort McDowell 3 days ago with supplies for the mining camp at Copper Ridge, a journey that should have taken her 2 days at most, but the weather had turned savage, and now she was lost somewhere in the mountains between the town and her destination, with night coming fast and the temperature dropping so quickly she could feel her breath freezing in her lungs. The mare stumbled, and Eleanor felt the animal's exhaustion in every labored step. She should stop, should find shelter, but there was nothing out here except pine trees and rocks and endless white. The wind howled like something alive and angry, tearing at her coat and whipping snow into her eyes until she could barely see 5 feet ahead. Her father had warned her not to make this trip alone, but Eleanor Bradford had never been one to listen to warnings. She was 23 years old and had been running supply routes through these mountains for 2 years, ever since her father's leg injury had left him unable to make the journeys himself. She knew these trails better than anyone, or she had thought she did. Now, with visibility reduced to nothing and every landmark buried under snow, she had no idea where she was. The mare stumbled again, more violently this time, and Eleanor felt the animal going down before she could react. The horse's front legs buckled, and then they were falling, sliding down an embankment Eleanor had not even seen through the curtain of white. She tried to kick free of the stirrups, tried to roll clear, but her frozen limbs would not respond fast enough. Her head struck something hard, and the world exploded into stars and then darkness. The mare scrambled to its feet and fled into the storm, following some instinct that told it to find shelter, leaving its rider lying motionless in the snow. Yates Crawford had been tracking the lost cattle for 6 hours when the blizzard hit, and he knew immediately that he was in trouble. He was 15 miles from the ranch, alone, with a storm that looked like it meant to bury the entire territory under 10 feet of snow. The smart thing would have been to turn back, to let the cattle fend for themselves and get to safety. But Yates had never been particularly smart when it came to his responsibilities. The ranch had lost too many head already this winter, and these dozen steers represented money the outfit could not afford to lose. He was a tall man, lean and weathered from 28 years of hard living, most of it spent working cattle across Arizona and New Mexico. He had a face that women sometimes called handsome, with dark eyes under heavy brows, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. Right now, that face was wrapped in a wool scarf, his hat pulled low, his body hunched against the wind as his gelding picked its way through the deepening snow. The cattle had taken shelter in a ravine, huddled together against the wind, and Yates managed to get them moving back toward the ranch. But the storm was worsening by the minute, and he knew they were not going to make it. He needed to find shelter, needed to hole up somewhere until the worst of it passed. There was an old line shack about 3 miles east, if he could find it in this white hell. That was when he saw the horse. The mare appeared out of the snow like a ghost, saddle empty, reins trailing. Yates felt his stomach drop. An empty horse in a blizzard meant one thing, and it was nothing good. He caught the mare's reins and saw the supply bag still strapped to the saddle, saw the ice already forming on the animal's coat. The horse had not been riderless long, maybe an hour at most. Yates turned his gelding in the direction the mare had come from and began following the trail of disturbed snow. The wind was already filling in the tracks, but he could still make out the path the horse had taken. He left the cattle where they were, knowing he might be signing their death warrant, but a person's life was worth more than a dozen steers. He found her 10 minutes later, a dark shape against the white, already half buried by the accumulating snow. For a terrible moment he thought she was dead, but when he dismounted and brushed the snow from her face, he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive but unconscious, and from the blood frozen in her hair, she had taken a serious blow to the head. Yates did not waste time trying to wake her. He scooped her up, surprised at how light she felt, and slung her across his saddle. She was dressed for winter travel, but no amount of clothing would save her if he did not get her warm soon. He could already see the pale white patches on her cheeks that meant frostbite was setting in. He tied the mare to his saddle and turned east, praying he could find the line shack before they all froze to death. The next hour was the longest of Yates Crawford's life. The wind screamed, the snow fell so thick he could barely breathe, and the woman across his saddle did not stir. He kept one hand on her back, checking periodically to make sure she was still breathing, while his other hand gripped the reins and his eyes strained to pierce the white curtain that surrounded them. He almost rode past the shack without seeing it. It was only the darker shadow against the white, a rectangular shape that did not belong to nature, that made him turn. The small cabin materialized out of the storm, one wall already drifted high with snow. Yates had never been so grateful to see anything in his entire life. He tied the horses on the leeward side of the shack where they would have some protection from the wind, grabbed the supply bags from both saddles, and carried the woman inside. The shack was barely bigger than a jail cell, with a crude fireplace, a wooden bunk, and not much else. But it had walls and a roof, and right now, that made it a palace. Yates laid the woman on the bunk and immediately set about building a fire. There was wood stacked against one wall, dry and ready, and within minutes he had flames crackling in the fireplace. Only then did he turn his attention to his patient. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, ice crystals clinging to her eyelashes. He stripped off her wet gloves and began rubbing her hands, trying to restore circulation. Her fingers were like ice, unresponsive, and fear clutched at his chest. He had seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, had even seen one man die from exposure after being caught in a storm not unlike this one. He removed her coat and boots, his movements efficient and clinical, then wrapped her in his own bedroll and the spare blankets he found in the supply bags. She had been carrying medical supplies, he realized, along with food and other goods. Someone's order, probably for one of the mining camps, which meant someone would be expecting her, would be worried when she did not arrive. But there was nothing to be done about that now. The storm was raging outside, and they were lucky to be alive. Yates stripped off his own wet coat and built up the fire until the small cabin began to warm. He checked the woman's pulse and found it steady, but weak. The gash on her head had stopped bleeding, but there was an ugly bruise spreading across her temple. Concussion, probably. He had seen enough injuries in his years to recognize the signs. He sat beside the bunk and watched her breathe, willing her to wake up, to open her eyes and tell him she was all right. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snow continued to fall. Eleanor woke to pain, a throbbing agony that pulsed through her skull with every heartbeat. She tried to open her eyes and found that even that simple movement hurt. The light was dim, firelight dancing across rough wooden walls, and for a moment she could not remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then it came back in fragments. The storm, the horse falling, the impact that had sent her tumbling into darkness. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun violently. A hand pressed gently against her shoulder, easing her back down. "Easy now. You took a hard knock to the head." The voice was male, deep and rough, but not unkind. Eleanor forced her eyes to focus and found herself looking at a stranger. He was dark-haired and unshaven, with eyes that looked almost black in the firelight. A cowboy from the look of him, weathered and trail-worn. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw and dry. "Old line shack about 3 miles east of Copper Creek. I found you in the snow. Your horse threw you, looks like." Memory rushed back, and Eleanor tried to sit up again despite the pain. "The supplies. I was carrying supplies. They are safe. Everything that was on your horse is here." The cowboy's hand was still on her shoulder, keeping her from rising. "You need to stay still. You have been unconscious for hours, and you took a bad hit. You are lucky to be alive." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist she was fine, but the pounding in her head and the weakness in her limbs told her he was right. She laid back against the thin pillow and tried to gather her thoughts. How long have I been out? Found you around 3 in the afternoon. It is past midnight now. 9 hours. She had lost 9 hours. Fear spiked through her chest. My father, he will be worried. Cannot do anything about that until the storm passes. This blizzard is not going to let up any time soon. The cowboy moved away from the bunk, and Eleanor watched him add wood to the fire. What is your name? Eleanor Bradford. People call me Ellie. She studied him in the firelight. Who are you? Yates Crawford. I work for the Circle C, about 20 miles south of Fort McDowell. Eleanor knew the ranch. Everyone in the territory knew the Circle C. It was one of the bigger outfits, running several thousand head of cattle across the high country. You are a long way from home. Was tracking lost cattle when the storm hit. Found your horse first, then followed the trail back to you. Yates turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. You were almost buried in the snow. Another 10 minutes and I would have ridden right past you. The implication hung in the air between them. Another 10 minutes and she would be dead. Eleanor had faced danger before, had dealt with everything from difficult river crossings to encounters with hostile wildlife, but she had never come quite this close to dying. The realization sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Thank you, she said quietly, for saving my life. Yates shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. Any decent person would have done the same. Still, thank you. He nodded and turned his attention back to the fire. Eleanor watched him move around the small cabin, his movements economical and purposeful. He was tall, she realized, probably a few inches over 6 feet, with the lean build of a man who spent his life in the saddle. There was a quiet competence about him that she found reassuring. Are you hungry? Yates asked. I have some jerky and hardtack. Not much, but it will keep you going. Eleanor's stomach growled at the mention of food, and she realized she had not eaten since breakfast. Yes, please. He brought her water first, making her drink slowly, then produced strips of dried beef and hard biscuits. The food was plain and tough, but Eleanor ate gratefully, feeling strength begin to return to her limbs. Yates ate his own meal in silence, sitting on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall. How bad is the storm? Eleanor asked when she had finished eating. Bad. One of the worst I have seen in these mountains, and I have been working this territory for 10 years. We are snowed in until it passes, and that might be another day or two. 2 days trapped in a tiny cabin with a stranger. Under normal circumstances, Eleanor's reputation would be ruined by such a situation. But these were not normal circumstances, and survival took precedence over propriety. I was supposed to deliver those supplies to the Copper Ridge mine. They will be expecting me. They will understand. No one sane goes out in weather like this. Yates stretched his legs out toward the fire. What were you doing traveling alone? These mountains are dangerous even in good weather. I run supplies for my father's business. We contract with the mines, and the smaller settlements deliver goods they cannot get themselves. Eleanor heard the defensive note in her voice and tried to soften it. My father used to make the runs, but he injured his leg last year. I have been doing it ever since. That is dangerous work for anyone, much less a woman alone. I can take care of myself. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw Yates raise an eyebrow. I have been making these runs for 2 years. This is the first time I have had trouble. Nearly dying counts as more than trouble. Eleanor could not argue with that. She laid back against the pillow, suddenly exhausted despite having been unconscious for hours. Her head throbbed, and her body felt like one massive bruise. How are the horses? Sheltered on the north side of the cabin. They will be all right as long as the storm does not get worse. Yates stood and moved to the bunk, looking down at her with concern. You should rest. Your body needs to heal. Eleanor wanted to protest, to stay awake and keep talking, but her eyelids were already drooping. The warmth of the fire, the food in her stomach, and the exhaustion of her ordeal were combining to pull her under. She felt Yates tuck the blankets more securely around her, felt the gentle pressure of his hand checking her forehead for fever, and then she was sliding back into darkness. When she woke again, gray light was filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls, and the wind was still howling outside. Yates was asleep on the floor near the fire, wrapped in his coat, his hat pulled low over his face. Eleanor watched him for a moment, this stranger who had saved her life, and wondered what quirk of fate had put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She sat up slowly, testing her body's response. The headache was still there, but duller now, and the dizziness had passed. She felt bruised and battered, but alive, and that was more than she had any right to expect. The movement woke Yates. He pushed his hat back and looked at her with those dark eyes, assessing. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell off a horse in a blizzard." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "But better than last night." Yates got to his feet and came to check on her, his hand cool against her forehead. "No fever, that is good. Concussion symptoms can be tricky." He studied her pupils, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "You are doing better than I expected." "I am tougher than I look." "I am starting to believe that." There was the faintest hint of admiration in his voice, and Eleanor felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at his words. Yates moved to the fire and began preparing a meager breakfast. He had coffee in his saddlebags, real coffee, and the smell of it brewing made Eleanor's mouth water. He brought her a cup along with more jerky and hardtack, and they ate in companionable silence while the storm raged outside. "Tell me about Fort McDowell," Yates said when they had finished eating. "I have only been through there a few times." "Do you live in town?" "My father and I have a house on the edge of town, near the old fort. We have been there for 5 years now, since we moved down from Prescott." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup. "What about you? Have you always worked for the Circle C?" "For the past 8 years. Before that, I drifted around, worked ranches in New Mexico and West Texas, got tired of moving, and decided to settle in one place." Yates refilled his own coffee cup and settled back against the wall. "The Circle C is a good outfit. The owner, Charles Carlyle, he treats his men fair and pays on time. That is more than you can say for a lot of ranches." They talked through the morning, swapping stories of life in the territory, and Eleanor found herself enjoying the conversation more than she had expected. Yates was quiet but thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. He had seen most of the West, had worked cattle from Montana to Mexico, and his stories painted a picture of a hard life lived well. In turn, Eleanor told him about growing up in Arizona, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about taking over her father's business and learning to navigate the rough country and rougher men who populated the mining camps and settlements. She had always been independent, had never been content to stay home and wait for some man to take care of her, and she could see that Yates respected that about her. By afternoon, the storm had not let up. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, the wind screaming around the cabin with renewed fury. Yates went out to check on the horses, coming back covered in snow, his face red from the cold. "Drifts are already 6 feet deep on the north side," he reported, stamping snow off his boots. "We are not going anywhere for a while." Eleanor tried not to feel trapped. The cabin was warm and dry. They had food and water, and she was alive. That was more than enough. But the walls seemed to press in on her, and she found herself pacing the small space, restless despite her lingering weakness. "You should rest," Yates said, watching her with concern. "Your body is still healing." "I have been resting. I feel like I am going to crawl out of my skin if I have to lie in that bunk for one more minute." Eleanor moved to the small window and peered out at the white chaos beyond. "I hate being stuck. I know the feeling. but fighting it will not make the storm end any faster. Eleanor turned to look at him. How do you stay so calm? Does nothing bother you? Plenty bothers me. I just learned a long time ago that worrying about things you cannot control is a waste of energy. Yeats added wood to the fire. You do what you can, and you accept what you cannot change. It was sound philosophy, Eleanor supposed, but she had never been good at accepting limitations. She was used to action, to solving problems, to making things happen. This enforced idleness chafed at her like ill-fitting boots. They spent the rest of the day playing cards with a worn deck Yeats produced from his saddlebags, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories. Eleanor discovered that Yeats had no family, that he had been orphaned at 15 and had been on his own ever since. He had learned to cowboy the hard way, working for men who were more interested in getting cheap labor than training young hands, and he had the scars to prove it. In turn, Yates learned that Eleanor had turned down 3 marriage proposals in the past 2 years, that she had a gift for numbers that made her invaluable to her father's business, and that she had once punched a drunk miner who had gotten too familiar with his hands. She was unlike any woman Yates had ever met, fierce and independent and utterly uninterested in conforming to what society expected of her. By the time night fell again, they had talked themselves out. They ate another sparse meal, and Eleanor settled back onto the bunk while Yates prepared to sleep on the floor again. You should take the bunk, Eleanor said. You have been sleeping on the floor for 2 nights now. That cannot be comfortable. I have slept in worse places. You are the one who is injured. I am fine, really. Eleanor sat up and pulled the blankets aside. We can share. The bunk is narrow, but it is big enough for 2 if we do not mind being close. Yates hesitated, and Eleanor could see the conflict on his face. Propriety warred with practicality, and she could tell which side was winning. Are you sure? I trust you. You saved my life. The least I can do is share the bunk so you do not wake up with a crick in your neck. Still, Yates hesitated for a long moment before nodding. He waited until Eleanor had settled on one side of the narrow bunk, then stretched out beside her, careful to leave as much space between them as possible. It was not much space. Eleanor could feel the heat of his body, could hear his breathing in the quiet cabin, and for some reason her heart was beating faster than it should. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the storm. Eleanor was acutely aware of every point where their bodies almost touched, of the strange intimacy of sharing a bed with this man she had known for barely 2 days. It should have felt wrong, should have made her uncomfortable, but instead, she felt safe in a way she had not felt in years. Yates, she whispered into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you. For everything. You have already thanked me. I know. But I want you to know that I mean it. You did not have to risk your life to save mine. You could have kept going. Could have left me there. No, I could not have. His voice was quiet but firm. I could not have lived with myself if I had left you to die. Eleanor turned her head to look at him in the firelight. His face was in profile, all sharp angles and shadows, and something in her chest tightened at the sight. You are a good man, Yates Crawford. He turned to meet her gaze, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. You should sleep, Eleanor Bradford. Tomorrow will be another long day. She wanted to say something more, to acknowledge the strange connection she felt growing between them, but the words would not come. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the warmth of his presence and the crackle of the fire lull her to sleep. The storm finally broke on the 3rd day. Eleanor woke to silence, the absence of wind so pronounced it was startling. She sat up carefully, her head almost clear now, and saw Yates already awake, standing at the window. It stopped, he said without turning around. We can leave as soon as we dig out. Eleanor should have felt relief, but instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. These 3 days in the cabin had been strange and isolated, a world apart from normal life, and part of her was reluctant to return to reality. She helped Yates pack up their meager supplies, moving carefully as her body protested the activity. She was still sore and bruised, but the worst had passed. She would survive, thanks to the man who was now saddling the horses in silence. The journey back to Fort McDowell took most of the day. The snow was deep, and they had to lead the horses through drifts that came up to their thighs in places. The sun was brilliant on the white landscape, almost blinding, and the cold was sharp and clean after the stuffiness of the cabin. They did not talk much during the ride. Yates was focused on navigating the difficult terrain, and Eleanor was lost in her own thoughts, trying to understand the tangle of emotions that had taken up residence in her chest. She had never been the type to develop feelings for a man quickly, had always prided herself on her practical nature when it came to romance. But there was something about Yates Crawford that had gotten under her skin, something about the quiet strength and unexpected kindness that drew her in despite her better judgment. Fort McDowell appeared in the distance just as the sun was beginning to set, and Eleanor felt her heart sink at the sight. Once they reached town, this strange interlude would be over. Yates would return to his ranch, and she would go back to her normal life, and that would be the end of it. Her father met them at the edge of town, his face a mixture of relief and worry. Samuel Bradford was a big man, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, and he swept Eleanor into a fierce hug the moment she dismounted. "Thank God," he murmured into her hair. "When the storm hit and you did not come back, I thought I had lost you." "I am all right, Papa, thanks to Mr. Crawford." Eleanor pulled back and gestured to Yates, who had dismounted and was standing a respectful distance away. "He found me in the snow after my horse threw me. Saved my life." Samuel turned to Yates, and Eleanor watched her father take in the cowboy's worn clothes and weathered face. For a moment she worried that her father would dismiss him, would thank him perfunctorily, and send him on his way. But Samuel Bradford had not built a successful business by being a poor judge of character, and whatever he saw in Yates seemed to satisfy him. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay," Samuel said, extending his hand. "Thank you for bringing my daughter home safe." Yates shook his hand, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just did what needed doing. Any decent man would have done the same." "That is where you are wrong. Not every man would have risked his life in a blizzard to save a stranger." Samuel's grip tightened. "You will stay for dinner." "I insist. It is the least we can do." Eleanor saw Yates start to refuse, saw the polite refusal forming on his lips, and she spoke before he could decline. "Please, I would like you to stay." Something in her voice must have conveyed her sincerity, because Yates hesitated, then nodded. "All right, thank you." Dinner at the Bradford house was a simple affair, but after 3 days of jerky and hardtack, it felt like a feast. Samuel's housekeeper had prepared beef stew and fresh bread, and Eleanor ate until she was uncomfortably full. Yates was quiet during the meal, answering Samuel's questions about the ranch and the storm, but Eleanor could feel his eyes on her whenever he thought she was not looking. After dinner, Samuel excused himself to check on something in his study, leaving Eleanor and Yates alone in the parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the comfortable room felt foreign after the bare simplicity of the line shack. "Your father seems like a good man," Yates said, breaking the silence. "He is. He raised me alone after my mother died, and he never once made me feel like I was less capable because I was a woman." Eleanor moved to stand by the fire. "I am lucky to have him." "He is lucky to have you." Yates stood and moved toward the door. "I should be going. It is a long ride back to the ranch." Eleanor felt panic flutter in her chest. She was not ready for him to leave, not ready for this to be over. "Will I see you again?" Yates turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was carefully neutral. "I do not know. The Circle C is a ways from here, and I am not often in town. But you might come to town sometimes. For supplies or business or something. Maybe." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Why does it matter?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, to say something casual and non-committal, but the words that came out were raw and honest. "Because I want to see you again. Because these past 3 days, Trapped in that cabin, I felt something I have never felt before, and I think you felt it too. Yates was silent for so long that Eleanor thought she had made a terrible mistake, had misread everything between them. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her face in his hands. And when he kissed her, it felt like coming home. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when Eleanor responded, winding her arms around his neck and pressing closer, it deepened into something fierce and desperate. 3 days of tension and unspoken desire poured into that kiss, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I felt it, Yates said, his forehead resting against hers. From the first moment I saw you lying in that snow, something in me recognized you. I have been trying to ignore it, trying to tell myself it was just the circumstances, but I cannot lie to myself anymore. Then do not leave. Eleanor's hands gripped his shirt. Stay, at least for tonight. We can figure out the rest tomorrow. Yates pulled back just far enough to meet her eyes. Your reputation. I do not care about my reputation. I care about this, about you, about whatever is happening between us. Eleanor knew she sounded desperate, but she did not care. Please, Yates, give us a chance. He kissed her again, softer this time, tender in a way that made her heart ache. I will stay. Not in the house, that would not be proper, but I will stay in town tonight. And tomorrow we can talk. Really talk about what this means and what we want. It was not everything Eleanor wanted, but it was enough for now. She walked Yates to the door and watched him collect his horse, watched him ride toward the small hotel in the center of town. When she turned back inside, she found her father standing in the hallway, watching her with knowing eyes. So that is how it is, Samuel said, but there was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. Papa, You do not need to explain. I saw the way you looked at each other during dinner. I saw the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching. Samuel put a hand on her shoulder. He seems like a good man, Ellie. But be careful, you have known him for 3 days. I know, but sometimes 3 days is enough. Eleanor met her father's gaze steadily. Sometimes you just know. Samuel sighed but smiled. You are so much like your mother. She made up her mind about me in 2 days, and nothing I said could change it. I suppose stubbornness runs in the family. Eleanor hugged her father tightly. I am not being foolish, I promise, but I need to see where this goes. I need to know if what I felt in that cabin was real or just the circumstances. Then you will find out. But take your time, Ellie. Love is not a race. But as Eleanor lay in her own bed that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Yates Crawford, she knew that time was not going to change how she felt. Something had happened in that storm, something beyond simple gratitude or proximity. She had found someone who saw her for who she really was, who did not try to change her or diminish her, and she was not about to let him slip away. Yates came back the next morning, just after breakfast, and he and Eleanor went for a walk through the snowy streets of Fort McDowell. They talked for hours, sitting on a bench near the old fort ruins, their breath making clouds in the cold air. They talked about their hopes and fears, about what they wanted from life, about whether the connection they felt was real or just a product of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. I have never felt this way about anyone, Eleanor admitted. I have had suitors, men who wanted to marry me, but I never felt anything more than mild interest. With you, it is different. It is like something inside me recognized something in you, and now I cannot imagine not having you in my life. Yates took her hand, his rough fingers intertwining with hers. I feel the same way. I have known a lot of women, had a few relationships that lasted a few months before fizzling out, but this is different. You are different. He paused, searching for words. I am just a cowboy, Eleanor. I do not have much to offer except hard work and honesty. Your father is a successful businessman, and you could have your pick of men with better prospects. I do not want prospects. I want you. Eleanor squeezed his hand. But we need to be practical. You work at a ranch 20 miles from here, and I have a business to help run. How would this even work? They spent the rest of the morning trying to figure that out. Yates could come to town once a week, on his day off. Eleanor could occasionally make supply runs that took her near the Circle C. They could write letters, could find ways to stay connected despite the distance. It was not perfect, but it was a start. Over the following months, they built a relationship one stolen moment at a time. Yates came to Fort McDowell every Sunday, and he and Eleanor would spend the day together, walking and talking and slowly falling deeper in love. Samuel watched their courtship with approval, and when Yates finally asked for permission to marry Eleanor 6 months after they had met, Samuel gave his blessing without hesitation. They were married in the spring of 1884 in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort McDowell. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Yates wore the only suit he owned, brushed clean and pressed. The ceremony was small, just family and a few close friends, but it was perfect. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Yates had secured permission from Charles Carlyle to bring his wife to the ranch, and Eleanor had moved into the small foreman's cabin that Yates had been promoted to just before the wedding. It was a far cry from the comfortable house in Fort McDowell, but Eleanor did not care. She was with Yates, and that was all that mattered. She continued to help her father with the business, making supply runs when weather and circumstances allowed, and Yates supported her independence, even when other men at the ranch commented on how unusual it was for a married woman to work. Eleanor loved him even more for that support, for never asking her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Their first child, a son they named William, was born in the winter of 1885 during another fierce snowstorm that reminded them both of how they had met. Yates held his son for the first time with tears in his eyes, and Eleanor watched her husband transform into a father with a love so fierce it took her breath away. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, Grace with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. The small cabin became cramped, and Yates began building an addition, working every spare moment to create more space for their growing family. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. Yates advanced at the Circle C, eventually becoming the head foreman, and Eleanor's reputation as a reliable supplier made the Bradford business more successful than ever. They weathered droughts and hard winters, cattle drives and difficult births, building a life together that was far from easy but rich with love and purpose. In 1889, when William was 4 and Grace was 2, Samuel Bradford fell ill. The sickness came on quickly, a fever that would not break, and within 2 weeks he was gone. Eleanor mourned her father deeply, but she found comfort in Yates and their children, in the family they had built together. Samuel had died knowing his daughter was loved and cared for, and that brought Eleanor some measure of peace. She inherited the business and continued to run it with Yates's help, training William from a young age in the art of supply management and logistics. The boy showed an aptitude for numbers that reminded Eleanor of herself, and she poured her knowledge into him, determined that the business her father had built would continue for generations. A third child arrived in 1891, another son they named Thomas, and the cabin addition was expanded once again. Money was sometimes tight, but they never went hungry, and their children grew up knowing they were loved beyond measure. The turn of the century brought changes to Arizona. The wild frontier that Eleanor and Yates had known in their youth was slowly being tamed. Railroads crisscrossing the territory, new towns springing up where once there had been only empty desert and mountains. But through it all, their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They celebrated their 20th anniversary in 1904, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. William had married a local girl and given them 2 grandsons, and Grace was engaged to a young rancher from Prescott. Thomas, at 13, was already showing signs of becoming as good a cowboy as his father. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked Yates one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains. The small cabin had long since been replaced by a proper house built with the money saved over years of hard work. Marrying me, taking on a wife who insisted on working, raising a family on a foreman's salary instead of finding someone with more conventional ideas? Yates turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes had not dimmed one bit in 20 years. I have never regretted a single moment. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted: a home, a family, a purpose beyond just getting by. You saved my life as surely as I saved yours that day in the snow. Eleanor leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Sometimes I still dream about that blizzard, about waking up in that cabin and seeing you for the first time. I was so scared, but you made me feel safe. You made me feel alive. Yates kissed the top of her head. I had been drifting through life, just existing, until I found you. You gave me a reason to build something permanent, to put down roots and invest in the future. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the colors bleed across the sky. The mountains were painted gold and purple, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. This land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was home, and they had built a good life here together. William came out onto the porch, his oldest son perched on his hip. Ma, Pa, dinner is almost ready. Grace says to come inside before the food gets cold. Eleanor stood, taking Yates's hand and pulling him to his feet. We are coming. Inside, the house was full of noise and laughter. 3 generations gathered around the big table that Yates had built when William got married. Grace was directing her younger brother in setting the table, while her fiancé helped their mother carry dishes from the kitchen. The grandsons were underfoot, getting in everyone's way with the enthusiastic clumsiness of young children. This was what mattered, Eleanor thought as she took her place at the table. Not the hardships they had endured or the obstacles they had overcome, but this: family, love, the bonds that held them all together. It had started with a chance encounter in a blizzard, a cowboy finding a woman dying in the snow, but it had become something so much bigger than either of them could have imagined. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the grandchildren were put to bed, Eleanor and Yates walked out to the barn to check on the horses. It was a ritual they had maintained for years, these quiet moments at the end of the day when they could be alone together. Do you remember the mare that threw me? Eleanor asked, stroking the nose of the gentle bay in the first stall. I wonder what happened to her. She found her way back to the ranch about a week after the storm. Your father sold her to a family in Prescott, said he could not bear to see you ride her again after what happened. Yates leaned against the stall door. I always thought that horse might have saved your life in a way. If she had not gotten free and found me, I never would have known you were out there. Fate works in mysterious ways. Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband. Everything that had to happen for us to meet, for you to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. If the cattle had not wandered, if you had not been tracking them, if the storm had hit an hour earlier or later. We could drive ourselves mad thinking about all the what-ifs. Yates put his arm around her waist. I prefer to focus on the fact that it did happen. And we found each other. They stood together in the quiet barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses settling for the night. After 20 years, the passion between them had evolved into something deeper and more enduring, a love that had been tested by time and hardship and had only grown stronger. I love you, Eleanor whispered, just as much as I did the day we married. More, maybe. I love you too. Yates turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but hope and determination. Thank you for finding me in the snow. Thank you for giving me a life I never could have imagined. Eleanor kissed him softly. Thank you for 20 years of happiness. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their path lit by the moon and stars. Inside, their children and grandchildren were settling in for the night, filling the rooms with warmth and life. This was their legacy, Eleanor thought. Not just the business or the ranch, but this family they had built together, this love that would endure long after they were gone. The years continued to pass, marked by the seasons and the milestones of family life. William took over more of the supply business, eventually running it entirely so that Eleanor could spend more time with her grandchildren. Grace married her rancher and moved to Prescott, but visited often with her growing family. Thomas became a skilled horseman and took a position managing a section of the Circle C, working under his father's direction. In 1910, Charles Carlyle passed away, and his son offered Yates a partnership in the ranch. It was an unexpected honor, a recognition of 30 years of dedicated service, and Yates accepted with gratitude. The promotion brought more financial security, and he was finally able to build Eleanor the house she had always dreamed of, a proper ranch house with a wide porch and room for all their children and grandchildren to gather. Eleanor continued to ride, even as she grew older, though she never ventured far alone and never in bad weather. The memory of that blizzard stayed with her, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could turn deadly, but it also reminded her of what she had gained. Every time she looked at Yates, she remembered the man who had saved her life and then filled it with more love than she had ever thought possible. They celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1914, and by then they had 7 grandchildren with an 8th on the way. The house was filled with family for the occasion, and as Eleanor looked around at the faces of the people she loved, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Eleanor and Yates sat on their porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the cool spring air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the air smelled of sage and pine. 30 years, Eleanor mused. When did we get so old? Speak for yourself. I am still young and spry. Yates laughed when Eleanor elbowed him gently. All right, maybe not so spry anymore, but I do not feel old when I am with you. Flatterer. But Eleanor was smiling. Do you ever think about what would have happened if that storm had not hit? If I had made it to Copper Ridge on schedule, and you had found your cattle, and we had never met? Sometimes, but it does not bear thinking about for long. The idea of living my whole life without knowing you, without this family we built, it is too sad to contemplate. Yates pulled her closer. I would have missed out on everything that matters. We almost missed each other completely. 10 minutes, you said. 10 more minutes, and you would have ridden past me. Eleanor shivered despite the blankets. I have never told you this, but sometimes I still have nightmares about that day. About the cold and the fear, about waking up, not knowing if I was going to survive. But you did survive. We both did. And we found something in that storm that most people search their whole lives for and never find. Yates turned her face toward his. We found each other, Eleanor. Against all odds, in the middle of a blizzard, miles from help, we found exactly what we needed. Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. I am so grateful. For all of it. Even the hard parts, the struggles, and the losses, because they brought us here to this moment. Me too. Yates kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Me too. They sat on the porch until late into the night, talking about the past and the future, about their hopes for their children and grandchildren. The conversation wandered and meandered, comfortable and familiar, punctuated by long silences that needed no filling. When they finally went to bed, Eleanor fell asleep in Yates's arms, just as she had every night for 30 years. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, a rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own breathing. This was home, she thought drowsily. Not the house or the ranch, or even Arizona, but this man who had saved her life and then spent 3 decades making that life worth living. The Great War came and went, touching Arizona only tangentially, and the Bradford Crawford family continued to grow and thrive. William's sons grew to adulthood and joined the family business, expanding it beyond supply runs to include a general store in Fort McDowell. Grace's daughters were all married with children of their own, and Thomas finally settled down with a school teacher from Phoenix, bringing yet another generation into the family. Eleanor and Yates grew old together, their hair turning gray, then white, their hands becoming gnarled with age and hard work. But the love between them never diminished, never faded into mere companionship or comfortable habit. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodnight, still found joy in each other's presence after 40, then 45, then 50 years of marriage. In 1934, on their 50th anniversary, the family gathered for a celebration that drew relatives from across Arizona and New Mexico. The ranch house was bursting at the seams, three generations crammed into every available space, and Eleanor and Yates held court like the patriarch and matriarch they had become. 50 years, William said during the dinner toast, his voice thick with emotion. 50 years of showing us what real love looks like. You two have set an example that all of us aspire to follow. You have shown us that marriage is not always easy, but it is always worth fighting for. Eleanor reached for Yates's hand under the table, and he squeezed her fingers gently. They had faced so much together: droughts and financial hardship, illness and loss, the everyday struggles of building a life in difficult country. But they had also experienced joy beyond measure, the birth of their children, the laughter of grandchildren, the quiet satisfaction of work well done, and a life well lived. That night, after the guests had finally dispersed and the house was quiet, Eleanor and Yates lay in their bed and talked about the life they had shared. "Do you have any regrets?" Eleanor asked, the same question she had asked on their 20th anniversary and their 30th, and now their 50th. "Not a single one." Yates's answer was the same as it had always been. "You have given me more than I ever dreamed possible. You have made my life meaningful." "You saved me," Eleanor whispered. "Not just that day in the snow, but every day since. You saw me for who I really was, and you loved me anyway. You never tried to change me or make me into something I was not. There was nothing to change. You were perfect exactly as you were." Yates's voice was soft in the darkness. "I am the lucky one, Eleanor. I found you dying in a blizzard, and you gave me a reason to live." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her cheeks. "I love you. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I will love you forever, in this life and whatever comes after." They fell asleep in each other's arms, just as they had for 50 years, two souls intertwined so completely that one could not imagine existing without the other. Eleanor Bradford Crawford passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1936, at the age of 75. She had been tending her garden that afternoon, talking to her great-grandchildren about the proper way to plant winter vegetables, and had gone to bed that evening feeling content and satisfied with her life. She simply did not wake up, slipping away so quietly that Yates did not realize she was gone until morning. The grief nearly destroyed him. For 52 years, Eleanor had been his constant companion, his partner in all things, the center around which his entire world revolved. Without her, he felt lost and adrift, untethered from the life they had built together. The family rallied around him, his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren providing comfort and support. They told stories about Eleanor, keeping her memory alive, reminding Yates of all the ways she had touched their lives. Slowly, painfully, he learned to live with the loss, though a part of him remained forever incomplete without her. Yates Crawford followed his beloved wife exactly 1 year later in the winter of 1937. He had been in declining health since Eleanor's death, his body finally giving out after 79 years of hard living. But those who knew him best said he had simply lost the will to go on without his Eleanor. He was laid to rest beside her in the small cemetery, overlooking the mountains they had both loved, under a sky so blue it seemed to go on forever. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and underneath an inscription that told their story in just a few words: "Together in this life and beyond. Love endures. The Bradford Crawford family continued to thrive long after Yates and Eleanor were gone. The business grew, the ranch prospered, and their descendants spread across Arizona and beyond, carrying with them the legacy of two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and meaning. And on winter nights, when the snow fell soft and silent over the Arizona high country, some swore they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the drifts, a cowboy and the woman he had saved, still together after all these years, their love as enduring as the mountains themselves. The story of how Yates Crawford found Eleanor Bradford dying in a blizzard became family legend, passed down through generations. Great grandchildren told it to their own children, embellishing some details, forgetting others, but always emphasizing the core truth that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that fate sometimes intervened in miraculous ways, and that two souls meant to be together would find each other no matter the obstacles. The old line shack where they had sheltered from the storm was eventually torn down, but the site was marked with a plaque placed there by William Crawford in honor of his parents. It read simply, "Here in the winter of 1883, two lives were saved, and one great love story began." Visitors to the Circle C Ranch, which remained in the Crawford family for generations, were always shown the plaque and told the story of the blizzard that had brought Yates and Eleanor together. It became a point of pride for the family, this romantic beginning to what had become a dynasty of sorts, proof that sometimes the best things in life came from the worst circumstances. Eleanor's horse, the mare that had thrown her and then inadvertently saved her by finding Yates, became part of the legend too. Though Eleanor had never learned what ultimately happened to the animal after her father sold it, family storytellers claimed the horse had lived to a ripe old age in Prescott, passing peacefully in its sleep, as if its purpose had been fulfilled the moment it brought the cowboy and the woman together. The supply business that Eleanor had worked so hard to build eventually evolved with the times, adapting to automobiles and paved roads, but it remained in the family for 3 generations before finally being sold in the 1960s. The new owners kept the Bradford name, honoring the woman who had risked her life making supply runs through dangerous country to serve the remote communities of Arizona. In Fort McDowell, where Eleanor and Yates had married and raised their family, a street was named after them in 1950, Crawford Way, running through the heart of the old town. The house where Eleanor had lived with her father still stood, carefully preserved by the Historical Society, and tour guides told visitors about the brave woman who had defied convention to work alongside men in the rough territory of the 1880s. The church where they had married became a popular site for weddings, couples drawn by the romantic story of Yates and Eleanor. Many wanted to begin their own marriages in the same place where such an enduring love had been consecrated, as if some of that devotion might transfer to their own unions. But beyond the plaques and the legends, beyond the stories told and retold until they took on the quality of myth, the real legacy of Yates and Eleanor Crawford was in the family they had built. Their descendants numbered in the hundreds by the dawn of the 21st century, spread across the country and the world, but all carrying within them some piece of the love that had created them. Some inherited Eleanor's fierce independence and business acumen. Others had Yates's quiet strength and unshakable integrity. Many had their combined stubbornness, that refusal to give up even when circumstances seemed impossible. But all of them, in one way or another, carried the knowledge that they came from love, from two people who had beaten incredible odds to find each other and build something lasting. On cold winter nights, when snow fell on the Arizona high country, the current generation of Crawfords would sometimes gather and tell the old story about a woman who fell from her horse in a blizzard miles from help, about a cowboy who found her unconscious in the snow and saved her life, about 3 days in a tiny cabin that changed everything, about a love that lasted 52 years and then beyond, enduring even death itself. And the children listening would ask if it was really true, if love could really happen that fast, that completely. And their parents would smile and say, yes, it could, because they had seen it with their own eyes in the way their grandparents or great grandparents had looked at each other, in the stories passed down through generations, in the very fact of their own existence. The blizzard had lasted 3 days, but the love it had sparked had lasted a lifetime and beyond, rippling out through generations, touching lives that Yeats and Eleanor could never have imagined. It was a testament to the power of connection, to the strength of two souls choosing each other again and again through hardship and joy, through decades of everyday moments that built up into an extraordinary life. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not that Yeats had found Eleanor in the snow, though that was miraculous enough. Not even that they had survived the storm and built a life together. The true miracle was in the choosing, in the decision to love each other fully and completely every single day for 52 years, to see each other at their worst and their best, to weather the inevitable storms that every marriage faces, and to come through it all with their love not just intact, but stronger. That was the legacy they had left behind. Not just the family they had created or the businesses they had built, but the example they had set. They had shown everyone who knew them what real love looked like, what it meant to truly be partners in all things, to support and cherish each other through whatever life brought. And on clear winter nights, when the moon shone bright on new fallen snow, some still claimed to see them. Two figures walking the high country they had loved, a cowboy and his lady, together as they had always been, as they would always be. Because love like theirs did not end with death, it was too strong, too pure, too deeply rooted in both their souls. Yates Crawford had gone into a blizzard looking for lost cattle and had found instead the other half of his heart. Eleanor Bradford had fallen from her horse miles from help and had been saved by the man who would become her entire world. And together they had built something that would last forever, a love story for the ages, begun in a winter storm and enduring long after the snow had melted and the years had passed. Their story was proof that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes, that fate worked in mysterious ways, and that love, when it was real and true and chosen every day, could overcome anything. It could survive blizzards and hardship, loss and grief, the simple grinding passage of time. It could build families and legacies, could change the course of lives not yet born. And that, in the end, was the true measure of what Yeats and Eleanor Crawford had accomplished. Not just surviving against the odds, but thriving. Not just finding love, but nurturing it into something extraordinary. Not just living their lives, but living them with purpose and meaning and deep, abiding joy in each other. The mountains where they had met still stood, eternal and unchanging. The snow still fell each winter, blanketing the high country in white. And somewhere in that wild landscape, the spirit of their love endured, a testament to two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had chosen every day for more than half a century to continue finding each other again and again and again. That was the story of Yates Crawford and Eleanor Bradford, a cowboy and the woman he saved, a blizzard and a love that burned brighter than any fire, a life built together, one day at a time, into something beautiful and lasting and true. And though they were long gone, their love remained, woven into the very fabric of the family they had created, enduring proof that true love never really dies. It just transforms, living on in the hearts and lives of those who come after, inspiring new generations to believe in the power of connection, the strength of commitment, and the enduring miracle of two people choosing each other against all odds.